I discovered the truth about my marriage on a Tuesday evening in October, but not in the way you'd think. It wasn't a text message left open on his phone or a credit card statement showing charges at a boutique hotel downtown. It was something far more deliberate, far more calculated, and infinitely more cruel. It was orchestrated humiliation dressed up as a charity gala, and looking back now, I realize that night was the moment everything changed for me. Not because my world fell apart, but because I finally understood what I was capable of. My name is Sarah, and I'm 25 years old. I live in Connecticut, in a house that costs more than most people earn in 5 years, and I drive a Range Rover that my husband, Marcus, bought me for my birthday last spring. On the surface, my life looked like something out of a glossy magazine spread in Architectural Digest or one of those lifestyle blogs that people scroll through at night, wondering how other women seem to have it all figured out. The problem with surfaces, though, is that they're just that. Surfaces. Beneath them, reality operates according to its own merciless rules, and I was about to learn that lesson in front of 300 of the most influential people in our state. The morning of the gala, I woke up in our California king bed in the master suite of Riverside Estate, our sprawling Georgian-style home in the Greenwich Hills neighborhood, and I felt something I'd been feeling more and more frequently over the past 6 months, a gnawing sense of wrongness that I couldn't quite articulate. Marcus had already left for his office at Pinnacle Realty Group downtown, where he served as senior vice president and managed commercial properties worth over $2 billion. He'd kissed me on the forehead as I pretended to still be asleep, a gesture that once felt like tenderness but had increasingly started to feel like habit, like the way you might pat a dog you'd owned for too long and stopped really seeing. I lay there for another 20 minutes, staring at the coffered ceiling, trying to pinpoint when exactly I'd started feeling like a guest in my own life. Our marriage had that particular quality that I've come to recognize as the death knell of genuine connection. It was perfect on every measurable level. We'd met 3 years ago at a benefit dinner for the Children's Hospital Foundation at the Stamford Regency, where my mother had insisted I volunteer for the planning committee. Marcus had been there as a major donor, and he'd approached me during the cocktail hour with the kind of confidence that comes from a lifetime of getting exactly what you want. Within 6 months, we were engaged. Within a year, we were married at the Sedgwick Country Club with a 4-course dinner and an orchestra that played until midnight. My parents had been thrilled. My mother had cried the happy tears she'd been saving for this moment since I was a little girl, and my father had given a toast that made everyone laugh and tear up simultaneously. It was the kind of wedding that people still referenced at dinner parties, the kind that made other women ask me for recommendations for photographers and florists. And for a while, I genuinely believed that Marcus loved me in the way that I loved him, with the kind of devotion that felt like it could sustain you through anything, that made you want to be better, to deserve the way someone was looking at you. But somewhere between the honeymoon in Bora Bora and the present moment, the texture of our connection had changed. Marcus started working later, attending more meetings, taking more calls during dinner. At first, I accepted it as the natural rhythm of a successful marriage, the inevitable trade-offs that come with being married to someone whose ambition runs as deep as his need for achievement. I'd been raised by a mother who taught me that a woman's job was to be the soft place where a man could land after the battles of the business world, and I'd internalized that lesson so thoroughly that I'd made it my entire identity. By October, I'd stopped asking him where he'd been, stopped wondering about the lipstick I'd found on his collar that wasn't my shade, stopped questioning why his phone screen went dark whenever I entered the room. I'd simply stepped back and given him space. The way you might give a plant that's slowly dying a little more room to breathe, hoping that somehow that would be enough to save it. The gala that evening was for the Eastbridge Foundation, a nonprofit that provided educational scholarships to underprivileged children throughout Connecticut and New York. Marcus had been tapped as one of the evening's major sponsors, which meant we'd need to attend, smile, and make an appearance that screamed success and generosity. I'd spent the afternoon at the Salon, a place called Lumineux in downtown Stamford, where they knew my usual order: balayage highlights, a deep conditioning treatment, and nails done in a soft nude that would photograph well. The esthetician, Denise, kept glancing at me in the mirror with the kind of look that suggested she wanted to ask if everything was okay, but she was too professional to pry. I appreciated her discretion, even as I hated that my unhappiness was apparently written across my face in letters large enough for a stranger to read. The dress I'd chosen was white, pristine, elegant white, the color of innocence and new beginnings. It was a custom gown designed by a boutique in New York called Ethereal Couture, with a sweetheart neckline and a subtle train that whispered against the floor when I walked. I'd ordered it 3 months ago, back when I still thought this marriage was worth investing in. Back when I imagined wearing it on Marcus's arm with pride instead of the creeping sense of dread that now accompanied every event we attended together. I wore my grandmother's diamond earrings and a bracelet of sapphires and platinum that Marcus had given me on our second anniversary. I looked like a woman who had everything, which I suppose I did, technically speaking. Everything except the one thing that actually mattered: a husband who loved me. Marcus picked me up at 7 o'clock. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo from a boutique on Madison Avenue in Manhattan, and he looked devastatingly handsome in the way that men who've never had to question their own worth tend to look. His dark hair was slicked back, his jaw was freshly shaved, and his cologne, something expensive from a French designer, filled the car with the scent of money and confidence. He didn't compliment my dress. He simply said, "You look fine," and pulled out of the driveway toward the Stamford Harbor Grand, where the gala was being held. The drive downtown took 15 minutes through the residential streets of Greenwich, past the manicured lawns and wrought iron gates that separated us from the rest of the world. Marcus talked about a property deal he was closing, about square footage and cap rates and the kind of language that had started to feel like a foreign language to me. I made the appropriate sounds of interest and agreement, the way I'd learned to do over 3 years of marriage, the way I'd learned to disappear into the background of my own life. The Stamford Harbor Grand was everything it promised to be, a sprawling 5-star waterfront venue with crystal chandeliers hanging from 30-foot ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the harbor. The valet took our car, and Marcus placed his hand on the small of my back, a gesture that once felt like protection, but now felt like ownership, as we walked across the marble entrance and into the ballroom. The space had been transformed for the evening. Tables draped in burgundy velvet were set with Waterford crystal and Lenox china, and centerpieces of white orchids and roses created small islands of elegance throughout the room. A string quartet played in one corner, and champagne flowed from an ice sculpture that had been carved into the shape of the Eastbridge Foundation's logo. Marcus guided me to table 12, where we were seated with 4 other couples, all of them business associates of his, all of them wearing the particular expression of people who'd purchased their attendance at significant personal expense, and intended to extract every ounce of networking value from the evening. The conversation was predictable. Talk of market trends, upcoming properties, vacation homes in Aspen and the Hamptons. I sat beside Marcus and smiled and sipped my champagne, and felt myself becoming more invisible by the second, like I was slowly disappearing into the background of my own marriage. Then, somewhere around 8:30, as the appetizers were being cleared and the silent auction was drawing to a close, I noticed Marcus checking his phone. His face had changed. There was an anticipation in it that I recognized, a tightness around his jaw that suggested he was bracing for something. He excused himself to the restroom, and I watched him weave through the crowd toward the back hallway where the private facilities were located. Something in my chest tightened. I don't know if it was intuition or just the culmination of 6 months of ignored red flags, but I found myself standing up, smoothing my white dress, and following him. The hallway was quieter than the main ballroom, softer, lit with recessed lighting that cast everything in a warm amber glow. I found him about halfway down, pressed against the wall in an alcove near the coat check, and he wasn't alone. She was young, probably mid-20s, maybe even younger, with dark hair and a body that didn't look like it had ever worked for anything it possessed. She wore a dress that cost probably less than my shoes, but she wore it with a confidence that suggested she didn't care. Marcus's hands were on her waist, and when he saw me, his expression didn't shift from guilty to apologetic. It shifted to something colder, something that looked almost like contempt. "Sarah," he said, as if he'd been expecting me, as if this confrontation was something we'd scheduled. "This is Brittany. She's the daughter of one of my business partners." Brittany smiled at me, a smile that held no apology, no shame, no recognition of what she was doing or what she represented. She looked at me the way you might look at an elderly woman sitting on a park bench, with a kind of polite disinterest, the way you'd look at something that used to matter but doesn't anymore. "Hi," she said, her voice high and breathy. "Marcus has told me so much about you." I don't remember what happened next with perfect clarity. I remember Marcus saying something about how I was being dramatic, about how I needed to calm down, about how this wasn't the time or place. I remember Brittany laughing, a sound like wind chimes made of glass, and moving her hand to his chest with the ease of someone who'd done it 100 times before. I remember the weight of my grandmother's earrings suddenly feeling impossibly heavy, like they were pulling my head down, dragging me deeper into a reality I didn't want to inhabit. And then I remember doing something that surprised both of us, I turned around and walked back down the hallway toward the ballroom. I didn't say anything. I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene. I simply walked away from Marcus and from Brittany and from the narrative I'd been telling myself about my marriage, and something inside me crystallized into something harder and colder and infinitely more focused than anger. I walked back into the ballroom and sat down at our table. I finished my champagne. I smiled at the couples around me and made small talk about their vacation homes and their children and their plans for the holidays. And then Marcus returned, and he sat down beside me as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just been pressed against a wall with another woman's hands on his body, as if I hadn't just watched the last 3 years of my life dissolve like sugar in water. The irony, and it was such a profound irony that I almost laughed, was that the main event was about to begin. The foundation's director was taking the stage. The live auction was about to start. The moment where people would pledge enormous sums of money to feel good about themselves, to feel like they were making a difference in the world, to feel like their wealth meant something other than the simple fact that they had more than other people. Marcus leaned over and whispered, "Try to smile. We're being watched." And that was when something inside me shifted completely. That was when I stopped being a woman whose marriage was falling apart and started being a woman with a plan. The foundation's director, a woman named Victoria Ashford, who'd been leading the Eastbridge Foundation for the past 12 years, took the stage to thunderous applause. She wore her authority like armor, her silver hair swept back in an elegant chignon, her voice carrying the kind of gravitas that comes from someone who genuinely believes in what they're doing. I watched her as she began to speak about the Foundation's mission, about the thousands of children whose lives had been changed through educational scholarships, about the systemic inequities that still plagued our education system despite our wealth and resources. She talked about poverty and opportunity, about the randomness of circumstance that determines whether a child in Bridgeport gets the same chances as a child in Greenwich. Her words were powerful, and under different circumstances, they might have moved me to tears. But I wasn't crying. I was thinking. I was calculating. I was making mental notes of every detail I could gather about the Foundation's work, their funding, their needs. Because somewhere in the chaos of discovering that my marriage was a lie, I'd had a moment of crystalline clarity. I wasn't going to fall apart. I wasn't going to confront Marcus with anger or demand explanations or dissolve into the kind of public spectacle that people would discuss for months at dinner parties. I was going to do something far more strategic, far more devastating, and infinitely more elegant. After Victoria's speech, the silent auction began in earnest. Waiters circulated with trays of appetizers, shrimp cocktail, beef Wellington canapes, caprese skewers with aged balsamic, and champagne glasses never seemed to empty no matter how much you drank. The auction items were the typical luxury offerings: a week at a villa in Tuscany, a private shopping experience at Bergdorf Goodman in Manhattan, a round of golf with a celebrity sports figure at Pebble Beach. Marcus bid on several items with the kind of casual confidence that suggested he wasn't really interested in winning so much as in demonstrating that he had the resources to win if he wanted to. He won a painting by a contemporary artist who'd recently been featured in Art Forum magazine, and he bid on it with the same detached interest he'd brought to our marriage, as if it was something to acquire, to possess, to use as evidence of his sophistication. I excused myself to the restroom around 9 o'clock, and as I walked through the hallway with its soft lighting and its marble floors that reflected everything back at you like a mirror, I saw Brittany. She was standing near the coat check, touching up her makeup in a compact mirror, and when she saw me, she didn't look away. She held my gaze for a moment, and I saw something in her expression that I recognized. She was young enough to believe that the world belonged to her, that the fact that she wanted something meant she deserved to have it, that there were no consequences for taking things that didn't belong to her. I went into the restroom, which was exactly what you'd expect from a 5-star venue. Italian marble, fresh flowers, attendants standing by with towels and spray cologne. I locked myself in one of the private stalls and sat down on the toilet seat, fully clothed, and allowed myself exactly 2 minutes to feel everything I was feeling. The betrayal, the humiliation, the rage, the bone-deep disappointment of discovering that the person I'd committed my life to was the kind of man who would do this, who would bring his mistress to the same event as his wife, who would display his infidelity with such casual cruelty that it could only be intentional. But after those 2 minutes, I washed my hands, I checked my reflection in the mirror, and I called my best friend, Olivia. Olivia Chen had been my best friend since we were 6 years old, when we'd met at the summer arts camp at the Westfield Arts Center, and discovered that we both loved reading and hated the girl who always got picked first in athletic competitions. We'd been inseparable ever since, and Olivia was the one person in my life who knew me well enough to recognize that something was profoundly wrong just from the tone of my voice when I asked her where she was. She was at home in her apartment in New Haven, where she worked as a corporate attorney at the firm Morrison & Drake, and she said she could be at the venue in 25 minutes if it was urgent. "It is," I said, and then I told her everything. I told her about the kiss, about Brittany, about the casual way Marcus had looked at me when I discovered them, as if my hurt was an inconvenience rather than a betrayal, and I told her about the idea that was beginning to form in my mind, the idea that had started as a whisper and was rapidly becoming a roar. Olivia arrived at the gala just before 10 o'clock, having made some excuse to her date about a work emergency. She wore her lawyer face, the expression she adopted when she was preparing to wage war on someone's behalf, and in this case, that someone was me. I pulled her into the hallway, and we stood near the restrooms, and I laid out the bare bones of my plan. I told her about the Eastbridge Foundation, about Victoria's speech, about the way she'd mentioned that they were $500,000 short of their annual fundraising goal. "Sarah," Olivia said, and I could see her mind working, could see her processing not just what I was saying, but what I was implying. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that I didn't marry Marcus for his money," I said. "My family has money. I've always had money. I had a trust fund from my grandmother that matured when I turned 21, and I've never touched it because I didn't need to. But right now, I'm thinking about what that money could do if I used it strategically instead of just letting it sit in an investment account, accumulating interest that I don't need." "You're thinking about donating," Olivia said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn across her face. "I'm thinking about donating $500,000 to the Eastbridge Foundation," I confirmed. "Not because I suddenly care deeply about educational equity, though obviously I support that, but because I'm thinking about how that donation would look. I'm thinking about my name being announced from that stage. I'm thinking about Marcus's face when he realizes that I know, and that instead of falling apart or making a scene, I've decided to do something that makes him look small and selfish by comparison." Olivia was quiet for a moment, and then she started to smile. It was the kind of smile that suggested she understood not just the letter of what I was saying, but the spirit of it. She understood that this wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. It was about reclamation. It was about taking back control of the narrative that was being written about my life, about refusing to be the victim in this story. "Okay," she said. "Let's talk logistics. We need to contact the foundation director. We need to make sure they can accommodate a donation of this magnitude. We need to make sure it's presented correctly, that it's announced publicly enough that Marcus will understand exactly what's happening." We spent the next hour in a quiet corner of the gala, working out the details on Olivia's phone, which she'd brought into the hallway for exactly this kind of strategic emergency. I called my investment advisor, a meticulous man named Richard Chen at Westbrook Financial Services, and told him I needed to liquidate $500,000 from my trust fund and have it transferred to a foundation account within 48 hours. Richard asked if everything was okay, if there was a problem, and I told him the truth. There was, but I was handling it. Then I called Victoria Ashford, the foundation director. She answered her phone even though she was in the middle of a gala, which told me something about her character and her priorities. When I explained who I was and what I was offering, there was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, and then she said something that I'd remember for years to come. "Sarah, I don't know what's prompted this generosity, but I can tell you that this donation is going to change the trajectory of our organization. This is going to allow us to reach 5,000 more children next year alone. Are you sure you want to do this?" I looked back into the ballroom, where Marcus was standing with a group of his business associates, where Brittany was circulating through the crowd with the confidence of someone who believed she'd won something. And I said yes. I was absolutely sure. The next 48 hours were a blur of logistics and preparation. I worked with Olivia to craft the language of the announcement, to make sure it would be presented not as a desperate act of a betrayed wife, but as a deliberate choice by a woman who understood the power of strategic generosity. I worked with my financial advisor to process the donation. I met with Victoria to discuss exactly how and when the announcement would be made. And I did all of this while maintaining the pretense of my normal life, while sitting across from Marcus at dinner and listening to him talk about his day, while sleeping in separate bedrooms and telling him that I needed space to think about our marriage, while he nodded and seemed almost relieved by my distance. I also did something else during those 48 hours. I bought a new dress. I went to Ethereal Couture in New York and worked with the designer to create something that would represent the woman I was becoming, rather than the woman I'd been. This dress was emerald green, a deep jewel tone that suggested confidence and power and transformation. It had a plunging neckline and a floor-length skirt that moved like water when I walked. It cost more than some people's cars, but that was precisely the point. I wasn't buying a dress. I was buying armor. The night of the gala's closing ceremony arrived, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. This was the moment I'd been working toward. This was the point in the story where the protagonist stops being passive and starts being active, where she stops waiting for other people to determine her fate and takes control of the narrative herself. I'd read somewhere once that the best form of revenge wasn't destruction, but transcendence, wasn't making someone else fall, but rising above them so completely that they cease to matter. That's what I was about to do. Marcus picked me up at 7 o'clock again, wearing the same confident expression he'd worn the night before, seemingly unaware that anything had changed. He didn't even comment on my new dress, though I noticed him doing a double take when he saw it. We drove to the venue in silence, and I spent the drive thinking about Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, about how every hero had to cross a threshold, had to face the ordeal that would transform them. That's what tonight was. That was my ordeal. The ballroom was set up differently than it had been the night before. The tables were gone, replaced by a standing reception area and a stage with a podium. The Eastbridge Foundation's board members and major donors were gathered in the center of the room, and I could see Victoria standing near the stage, clipboard in hand, checking off details. When she saw me arrive, she gave me a subtle nod, a gesture that confirmed everything was in place. Marcus mingled with his colleagues, and I stood apart from him, accepting congratulations from people who'd heard about my donation through the grapevine. They called me generous and visionary and charitable, and they seemed genuinely impressed by what they believed was my philanthropic impulse. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't being philanthropic. I was being strategic. I was weaponizing grace. And then Victoria took the stage, and the room quieted, and she began to speak about how the Foundation's mission could only be accomplished with the support of people who believed in the power of education to transform lives. She talked about the gap between where they were and where they needed to be, about the $500,000 that stood between them and their goals for the coming year. And then she said my name. I walked toward the stage, and I felt every eye in the room turn toward me. I felt Marcus's confusion crystallizing into understanding. I felt Brittany's superiority dissolving into something uglier and more threatened. And I stepped up to the microphone and I spoke. If you're watching this right now, I want to ask you to do something for me. If this story of a woman choosing grace over revenge, choosing her own power over the destruction of someone else, if this resonates with you, then please like this video. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the rest of her journey. Turn on your notification bell because the conclusion of this story is going to change everything you think you know about what real power looks like. And in the comments below, I want you to tell me what you think about a woman who chooses to rise instead of fall, who chooses to build instead of destroy. Leave a comment that says something like, "True strength is measured in grace, not in revenge," or whatever resonates with you. Let's create a community of people who understand that the most powerful thing a woman can do is refuse to diminish herself. I'm contributing this donation, I said, my voice steady and clear across the microphone, because I believe in investing in futures that matter. I believe in supporting organizations that understand that our education system is the backbone of our society, that it's where we as a culture decide who we value and who we leave behind. I believe in supporting people like Victoria and the work that she's doing, and I believe in demonstrating that character matters more than power, that integrity matters more than appearance, and that sometimes the most courageous thing a woman can do is choose grace over anger. I paused, and in that pause, I made eye contact with Marcus. I held his gaze for a moment, long enough for him to understand that I knew everything, that I was choosing to respond not with destruction, but with transcendence. I'm choosing to invest in something bigger than myself, I concluded, because that's what powerful women do. We don't diminish ourselves by focusing on the people who hurt us. We expand ourselves by focusing on the world we want to create. The applause was immediate and overwhelming. People stood up. They were crying. They were moved not just by the donation, but by something they seemed to recognize in what I'd said. Something about dignity and strength and the quiet power of a woman who refused to be defined by someone else's betrayal. And as I stepped down from the stage, I knew that my life had fundamentally changed in that moment. Not because my marriage was ending, though it was, but because I had finally understood who I was beneath the role I'd been playing, and I liked her infinitely more than I'd ever liked the woman I'd been before. The first thing that happened after I stepped down from the stage was that Marcus disappeared. Not physically. He was still in the ballroom somewhere. I could feel his presence like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. But mentally, his entire being seemed to contract inward, as if he was trying to make himself small enough to disappear entirely. I watched from across the room as he stood with a group of his colleagues, and I saw the moment they began to understand what had just occurred. Their expressions shifted from confusion to comprehension to something that looked like sympathy mixed with schadenfreude, that particular pleasure people take in watching someone else's carefully constructed facade crumble in real time. Brittany was no longer in the ballroom. She'd left sometime during my speech, and I couldn't help but feel a certain satisfaction at that fact. She'd arrived believing she'd won something, believing that she was the woman who mattered, and she'd left understanding that she was dispensable. That's the thing about women like Brittany. They believe that they're special, that the rules don't apply to them, that their youth and beauty make them untouchable. And they're right for a while, but only until they meet a woman who understands that beauty fades and youth passes, and what remains is the woman you've built yourself to be. What remained for Brittany was nothing. What remained for me was everything. Olivia found me near the bar, where I was standing with a glass of sparkling water, watching the chaos unfold like I was observing a film rather than living it. She grabbed my hand and squeezed it, and her eyes were shining with tears and something else. Pride, maybe, or recognition. She pulled me into the ladies' room, and we stood in front of the mirror, and she said something that I needed to hear. You did it. You actually did it. You took your power back. The irony was that I hadn't realized how completely I'd given my power away until I took it back. For 3 years, I'd organized my entire existence around Marcus, around his schedule, his moods, his ambitions, his needs. I'd made myself smaller and softer and more accommodating, believing that this was what love required, what marriage demanded. I'd convinced myself that my role was to be the woman standing beside him, not the woman standing in front of him. And in doing so, I'd become invisible to myself in exactly the same way that I'd become invisible to him. But something had shifted when I walked to that stage. Something fundamental had realigned inside me, and I understood that I'd spent the past 3 years becoming the kind of woman who would accept this kind of treatment, and it was going to take far more than one moment of public triumph to undo that damage. When I left the ladies' room, I found Marcus waiting for me in the hallway. He looked smaller than he had before, diminished somehow, as if my moment of power had somehow subtracted from his. He was trying to adopt his usual expression of casual confidence, but I could see the strain around his eyes, the tightness in his jaw that suggested he was barely holding it together. We need to talk, he said, and there was something almost pleading in his voice that I might have responded to a day ago, that might have made me want to comfort him and minimize what he'd done. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I know what we need to do, I said quietly. We need to call Edward Carmichael and tell him to start drawing up divorce papers. Edward Carmichael was a divorce attorney, one of the most ruthless in Connecticut, based out of offices in the Hartford Professional Tower. I'd already called him that morning before the gala, and we'd had a preliminary consultation over the phone. He'd advised me on how to protect my assets, how to document Marcus's infidelity, how to position myself in the divorce proceedings so that I came out on top not just financially, but morally. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, confusion, and finally something that looked like understanding. He seemed to realize in that moment that this wasn't a reaction he could negotiate his way out of, that I wasn't going to be placated by promises or explanations or the kind of superficial apologies that men like him offered when they were caught. This was the end, and he could feel it. "Sarah," he said, reaching for my arm, but I stepped back. "Please, let's go home. Let's talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about," I said, and I meant it. You made your choices. I'm making mine. I walked back into the ballroom alone, and I spent the rest of the evening doing something I'd never done before. I focused entirely on myself. I talked to the board members of the Eastbridge Foundation. I discussed educational policy with Victoria Ashford. I networked with women who were doing meaningful work in the nonprofit sector. I laughed with people who wanted to celebrate my generosity. And I did all of this without once looking at Marcus, without once acknowledging his presence in the room. I'd rendered him invisible, and there was a particular kind of power in that. When I got home that night, to the guest house on Riverside Estate where I'd been sleeping while maintaining the pretense of still being married, I sat in the kitchen and called my mother. She was in Palm Beach, where she and my father spent the winters, and it was already past midnight. but she answered on the second ring because that's what good mothers do. I told her everything. I told her about Brittany, about the donation, about my decision to divorce Marcus. And instead of the shock and disappointment I might have expected, my mother said something that surprised me. Good. I was wondering when you were going to wake up to what he was. What do you mean? I asked. Sarah, darling, I've known for months that something was wrong. A mother can sense these things. But I knew that me telling you wouldn't matter. You had to figure it out for yourself, and you had to decide what you were going to do about it on your own terms. I'm proud of you for not just leaving, but for leaving in a way that transforms you, instead of diminishing you. The next few weeks were a blur of logistics and emotional processing. My attorney, Edward Carmichael, worked with a therapist specializing in divorce trauma, and between the two of them, I began to understand the ways in which I'd abandoned myself in pursuit of a relationship that was never going to fulfill me. Marcus, through his own attorney, tried to negotiate a settlement that would allow him to control the narrative. He wanted to frame this as a mutual decision, a joint choice to move apart rather than a betrayal and an abandonment. But I wasn't interested in protecting his reputation. I was interested in protecting myself. We filed for divorce on a Tuesday morning in November, and by that afternoon, the story had leaked to the Connecticut Advocate, one of the major newspapers in the state. The article framed it as a high society split, mentioned my substantial donation to the Eastbridge Foundation in the same paragraph as Marcus's infidelity, and managed to make the entire thing sound like something out of a social drama. People I hadn't heard from in years suddenly felt compelled to reach out. My mother's friends called to express their support. Business associates of Marcus began to distance themselves from him, suddenly deciding that his character was more questionable than they'd previously believed. The foundation decided, in collaboration with Victoria Ashford, to create a scholarship fund in my name. The Sarah Riverside Educational Excellence Fund would provide full scholarships to 50 underprivileged students each year, students who demonstrated both academic promise and the kind of resilience that suggested they were capable of transcending the circumstances of their birth. When Victoria told me this, I cried for the first time since the night of the gala. Not because I'd received recognition, but because I understood that something good had come from my pain, that my betrayal had been transformed into an opportunity for other people to transform their lives. About 2 weeks after filing for divorce, I went to see my therapist, Dr. Sarah Weinstein, at the offices of Riverside Mental Health Associates in downtown Stamford. I'd been seeing her twice a week since the gala, working through the ways in which I'd learned to diminish myself, the ways in which I'd been taught by my society and my culture that a woman's primary job was to make herself acceptable to the men in her life. Dr. Weinstein was a woman in her 50s who'd been divorced twice herself, and she had a particular kind of wisdom that came from having been broken and having put herself back together. You're going to have days when you question whether you made the right choice, she told me during one of our sessions. You're going to have moments when you see Marcus and remember the good times, and you're going to feel a pull toward going back. That's not weakness. That's just the human heart trying to protect itself by returning to something familiar. But I want you to remember that familiar isn't always good. Comfortable isn't always healthy. You're building yourself into a new shape, and it's going to feel weird for a while. By December, the divorce settlement had been finalized. Marcus had fought for more money, more of the joint assets, more of everything. But because I had documentation of his infidelity, because I'd moved quickly to protect my own interests, and because my attorney was far better at this kind of warfare than his was, I came out ahead. I kept the guest house on Riverside Estate. I received a settlement of $3 million plus ongoing alimony. I received the Range Rover and the jewelry he'd given me. And most importantly, I received my freedom. The day the divorce was finalized, I drove to a small town called Millbrook, about 30 minutes north of our home, and I went to a restaurant called the Harvest Table. It was a farm-to-table establishment run by a chef named Michael Torres, who'd trained in France and had decided to move back to Connecticut to be closer to his aging parents. I sat at the bar alone, ordered their tasting menu paired with local wines, and I celebrated. I celebrated not the end of my marriage, but the beginning of a new version of myself. I celebrated the woman who'd had the courage to walk away. I celebrated the woman who'd chosen to rise instead of fall. By January, I'd decided what I was going to do with the rest of my life. I enrolled in graduate school at Yale University in their program for nonprofit management. I wanted to understand the systems that perpetuated inequality, the structures that left some children with infinite opportunity while leaving others with almost none. I wanted to do work that mattered, work that transformed lives, work that required me to be present and engaged and fully alive. I also started spending time with someone new. Not romantically, I wasn't ready for that, but as a friend, as someone who understood what I'd been through. His name was James, and he was a divorce mediator who worked in the same building as my attorney. We'd met while I was waiting for a meeting with Edward, and we'd started having coffee together, talking about relationships and heartbreak and the ways in which people hurt each other and then have to figure out how to forgive themselves and move forward. About 6 months after the gala, I ran into Brittany at a coffee shop in Greenwich. She was alone, looking smaller somehow, less confident. When she saw me, she turned away, which told me everything I needed to know. She'd realized what she'd cost Marcus. Not money, not marriage, but reputation, standing in our social circles, the ability to maintain the facade of being someone worth respecting. And she'd realized, I suspected, that she'd never been as important as she'd believed. I didn't feel satisfaction when I saw her. I felt something more complicated, a kind of pity mixed with understanding. She was a woman who'd been taught by the world that her primary value was her ability to attract men, and she'd acted on that teaching. But she'd never learned what I was learning, that a woman's primary value is the person she's becoming, the work she's doing, the way she shows up in the world for herself and for other people. By the time I turned 26, I'd transformed completely. I was no longer Marcus's wife. I was no longer the woman who'd organized her life around someone else's needs. I was Sarah, a woman with a purpose, a woman with a plan, a woman who'd learned that the most powerful form of revenge wasn't destruction, but transcendence. I'd learned that when someone tries to diminish you, the appropriate response isn't to diminish them back. It's to become so expansive, so full of purpose and power and presence, that their attempts to diminish you become irrelevant. Listen to me when I say this. Your value isn't determined by the people who love you or who leave you. Your value isn't determined by the marriage you maintain or the relationships you end. Your value is determined by the person you're building yourself to be, by the work you're doing in the world, by the way you show up for yourself and for other people. If you're in a situation where someone is making you smaller, where they're diminishing you, where they're asking you to be less than you're capable of being, then the most courageous thing you can do is walk away. Not in anger, but in power. Not in destruction, but in grace. Not because they don't deserve to suffer, but because you deserve to rise. I'm still in touch with Victoria Ashford and the Eastbridge Foundation. The scholarship fund that bears my name has transformed the lives of hundreds of young people who otherwise wouldn't have had the opportunity to attend college. Marcus, last I heard, had moved to Boston with someone new, and they were trying to rebuild what he'd destroyed. Olivia and I remain best friends, and we talk regularly about how we're going to change the world through our work and our choices, and our refusal to diminish ourselves for anyone. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I think about the woman I was at that gala, standing in her white dress, about to have her heart broken in front of 300 people. I think about her, and I'm grateful for her. Grateful that she had the capacity to hurt enough to eventually transform that hurt into something powerful and purposeful. Because that woman, that heartbroken woman in white, she was the chrysalis from which I emerged. She was the catalyst for everything I've become. That's the real story. That's the real revenge. It's not about making someone else suffer. It's about refusing to let their choices determine your future. It's about taking the pieces of your broken heart and building something beautiful with them. It's about becoming so fully yourself that you make it impossible for anyone else to define who you are. And if you're watching this right now, and you're in a situation where someone is making you smaller, where they're asking you to diminish yourself, where they're treating you as if you're less important than their own desires, I want you to know something. You are not obligated to stay. You are not obligated to forgive. You are not obligated to protect their reputation, or preserve their feelings or make their lives easier. You are only obligated to yourself, to your growth, to your transformation, to becoming the fullest expression of who you're capable of being. So get yourself a good attorney. Call your best friend, put on the emerald dress, and rise.